Greetings, this is Greg. I want to talk about supercharger boost and how that relates to pulley sizes. There seems to be quite a bit of confusion about this on the internet, but it's really pretty simple once you understand the basics. So I'm going to give you the answers first, meaning explain how to calculate it. Then I'll explain all the hows and whys and variables you'll need to be concerned with. So to start off, you need to determine the supercharger drive ratio. That is, how fast it spins relative to the engine. And to do that, you're just going to divide the crankshaft pulley diameter that's driving the supercharger by the supercharger pulley diameter. So for example, if your crankshaft pulley is 6 inches in diameter, which would not be unusual, and your supercharger pulley is 3 inches, 6 divided by 3 is 2. So your supercharger has a 2-to-1 drive ratio in this case. Simple. I'm sure everybody's keeping up. Then you want to take your supercharger displacement. Positive displacement superchargers are typically rated in displacement per revolution. In this case, we're going to use a really big supercharger. It could be a Roots or a Lysholm, either one. And let's say it displaces 200 cubic inches per revolution, which would be a pretty darn big supercharger, but they do exist that big and much larger. Now we're going to put this supercharger with our 2-to-1 drive ratio onto a 400 cubic inch V8. Again, not unusual. Ford, GM, and Chrysler all built 400 cubic inch V8s, and American Motors had a 401, close enough. Now we're going to take half of that engine displacement, so half of 400, and now we've got really all the numbers that we're going to need. So we take the drive ratio, 2-to-1, we multiply that by that supercharger displacement, which remember was 200 cubic inches, so we get 400. Now we're going to divide that by half of the engine displacement, which was 200. So 200 goes into 400 twice. Now that's our pressure ratio, meaning that if everything is just going really well, the outlet pressure of the supercharger will be twice the inlet pressure. Now inlet pressure, normal day at sea level, standard day, will be 14.7 psi. So we know that the outlet pressure will be twice that. So we multiply 14.7 by 2, and then that's the total pressure on the outlet side of the supercharger. And then to find boost above atmospheric, we subtract the atmospheric pressure, which was 14.7, which is what we have at the inlet in this case. And we end up with 14.7 pounds of boost in this case. So that's the gist of it. Now let's get into the details. Take a look at the top of this screen and you'll see all the critical information we're going to need to do the calculation. The pulley diameters, which are in inches, and the displacements of the supercharger and engine, which are in cubic inches. Keep in mind you can use the metric system here or whatever you want. We're going to start off by determining the supercharger drive ratio. We do that by dividing the crank pulley diameter by the supercharger pulley diameter, which is 6 divided by 3, so we get 2. The supercharger drive ratio is thus 2-to-1, meaning the supercharger will go through 2 full revolutions for every engine revolution. Now we want to multiply that drive ratio by the supercharger displacement because we need to know how much air the supercharger moves per engine revolution. And we're assuming that we're in a perfect world right now, and I know that we're not, and we're going to correct for the variables later. So 2 revolutions of the supercharger, 200 cubic inches per revolution. That means that every time the engine goes through 1 revolution, the supercharger moves 400 cubic inches of air. Now we need to determine what the pressure ratio is going to be. In other words, the air pressure on either side, the inlet versus outlet side of the supercharger. Well, to know that, we have to know how much space we have available for the supercharger to push that air into. And this has a whole lot to do with engine displacement. The bigger the engine, the easier it's going to be for the supercharger to shove it in there, so the less pressure or the less boost you're going to have. Now, we've got a 400 cubic inch engine in this case. Assuming that that engine has 100% volumetric efficiency, that means we have about 200 cubic inches of space to shove our 400 cubic inches of air into. Why 200 cubic inches? Because the engine is a 4-stroke engine. So in 1 revolution, only half of its cylinders or half of its displacement had an intake stroke. So we need to put 400 cubic inches of air into 200 cubic inches of space. Well, in order to do that, we're going to have to double the pressure of the air, and that is in fact what is going to happen when we shove that much air into that much space. Again, we're assuming a perfect world. And that gives us our pressure ratio, which in this case is 2-to-1. Pressure ratio is how much air divided by how much space you're putting it into. So 400 cubic inches of air divided by 200 cubic inches of space, which is half the engine displacement, gives us a number 2. Our pressure ratio is 2-to-1. Now, to figure out what that is in terms of boost, we have to take the air pressure at the supercharger intake, which is 14.7 psi in this case, and multiply it by the pressure ratio. So 14.7 times 2, and then we subtract atmospheric pressure, which in this case is the same as inlet pressure, and we get 14.7 pounds of boost. So I want to give credit where credit's due. This formula is not mine. It came from Jerry Magnuson of Magnuson Supercharger, and I want to tell the story really quickly because it's important to really fully give the credit here, even though he's long since passed away, sadly. About 25 years ago, I was putting a Magnuson MP62, which is a 4th generation, modern at the time, small displacement root supercharger, onto an Alfa Romeo V6 2.5 liter engine. And the supercharger came with a pulley. Now, when I first started learning about supercharging, and the older guys here are going to remember what I'm talking about, I went to the mall, and every mall in America at that time had 2 bookstores on it, Walden Books and B. Dalton. I went into both of those, bought every supercharging book they had, and then I went over to Barnes & Noble or Borders, whatever it was, and bought them there too. And in all these books, they had charts for supercharger pulley sizing for very specific applications, like a GMC 671 onto a small block Chevy or whatever. Nothing that did me any good. So I called up Magnuson and I asked, hey, do you guys have some sort of formula or way to calculate what boost the pulley you gave me is going to give me and what changes I'll need to get my desired level of boost? I think I was going for 10 pounds or whatever it was. And the guy at Magnuson, trying to be helpful, said, yeah, sure, we found that if you just run the pulley you've got, it's going to be fine because we've worked all this out. And if you change the pulley diameter 0.2 of an inch, it's going to give you such and such boost change. And I said, well, wait a minute. That might be fine for what you're doing, but you guys are running an engine of known displacement, 5.7 liter. I'm running a 2.5, so I'm in a completely different world. And 0.2 of an inch on my supercharger pulley is going to be a bigger change to the pressure ratio than on yours, or at least a very different pressure ratio change because of a very different crank pulley size. And the guy said, oh, yeah, hold on a minute. Let me transfer you to somebody else. Well, he transferred me to Jerry Magnuson. That's a pretty big deal. This was back in the days when you call up a company and actually sometimes get the owner on the phone. But even back then, that was pretty rare. So I was pretty surprised to find myself talking to Jerry Magnuson. And furthermore, I was surprised that he spent so much time on the phone with me. I think he talked to me for 15 or 20 minutes explaining to me some basic stuff about supercharging that wasn't on his website, wasn't any of these books. And furthermore, he emailed me the calculator that he used to calculate boost. And a lot of that information is what I'm conveying to you in this video, although I've had a lot of my own personal experiences with superchargers since then, and so it's not all from Magnuson, but a lot of it is. So again, giving credit where credit's due. So I want to talk about some of the variables that are going to stack up here and possibly work against you. The first variable to discuss is supercharger sizing. This formula will only work without significant changes to it. For a supercharger that is within 1/3 to say 1/2 of engine displacement. In other words, if it's a 300 cubic inch engine, a supercharger between 100 and 150 cubic inches, which is normally what you're going to want to do. If you look at the OEM kits, they're usually closer to 1/3, and the aftermarket kits, the hotter ones anyway, are usually closer to 1/2 of engine displacement. But that's generally the range that people stay in. Now, there are some weird situations where you might want to go with something a whole lot bigger, and sometimes people do it just for show. Like sometimes you'll see a 400 cubic inch supercharger on a 350 Chevy, and they underdrive it like crazy to make it work, and it does work, but it's usually not really desirable. And one of the problems is with a really, really big supercharger on a really small engine, you can run into a situation where the supercharger never spins fast enough to get its volumetric efficiency up into where it really needs to be, which is the next variable we need to look at, and this kind of relates to supercharger sizing as well. The supercharger has its own volumetric efficiency curve, and this is independent of the engine's volumetric efficiency, which is also going to play in. The supercharger's volumetric efficiency for a good modern supercharger, so let's say Magnuson, Sprintex, Whipple, Kenny Bell, probably some others, but those are the ones that come to mind. Those superchargers generally have a volumetric efficiency between 65% at very low RPM and maybe 95% at very high RPM. And this is part of the reason that these Roots and Lysholms, even the modern ones, don't have perfectly flat boost curves. In other words, if you have a engine that pulls to 7,000 RPM and you have a supercharger pulley set up to give you 10 pounds at 7,000 RPM, you'll find you probably only get 5 pounds at 2,000 or something like that. And then the boost will increase at a somewhat linear rate, and then it'll start to flatten out at very high RPM because the supercharger's volumetric efficiency flattens out at a really high RPM. Now, if you use a really big supercharger, you end up stuck in that lower RPM range, and the boost never gets up to where it can flatten out. So you have a steeper boost curve than you would have with a properly sized supercharger, which is a little bit less desirable in most situations. Now, the volumetric efficiency of these better superchargers, like I say, they top out 90 to 95% usually. It's a little hard to predict, though, because while they increase with RPM in volumetric efficiency goes down in boost. And if you pause and think about that for a moment, you'll see that creates a bit of a quandary, because the way we increase boost, generally speaking, is by putting a smaller supercharger pulley on there and spinning the supercharger faster, which is great. More boost and also increased volumetric efficiency. But the increased boost then lowers the volumetric efficiency. So it's hard to predict volumetric efficiency just perfectly. But just as a general rule, you can use 90 or 95%. And if you want to factor that into the calculation, it's easy to make that correction. After you multiply your supercharger displacement by your drive ratio, then you can take that number and multiply it by 0.9 or 0.95 or whatever to figure out a more accurate number for the amount of air the supercharger is going to move. Then the next thing to figure in is the engine's volumetric efficiency, because that affects the amount of space that we have to shove this air into. As an extreme example, in the mid to late 70s, all the companies were building these 400 cubic inch engines that had just seemingly no horsepower. I mean, Pontiac had one. I shouldn't say no horsepower. I mean, they were okay for the day. But for example, you could get a Lincoln Town Car, and I think those things, I'm not going to look this up, but I think they had 160, 170 horsepower out of a 400 cubic inch V8. And it was an advanced V8, canted valves and everything. But Ford did all kinds of stuff to hamstring this engine under the assumption it was going to help emissions. That's a whole nother discussion. But the point is, these engines had no horsepower. They had no volumetric efficiency. And so if you put a supercharger on that, you are going to get unusually high boost levels, which is a little bit counterintuitive. You're going to get low power, but unusually high boost, because it's analogous to putting the supercharger on a smaller engine. Even though the engine has that displacement, the supercharger has a really hard time forcing the air past the intake valves, and you get an unusually high boost number and unusually low power for what you're doing. Now, I would expect that if somebody was to take one of these 400, and by the way, I've never seen anybody soup up one of these 400 Fords, which is a shame because I think it had some potential. But if somebody was to take one of these things and supercharge it, I would hope that they would take the trouble to have a new cam crown for it and clean up the heads or whatever they needed to do to make it so the supercharger could really work effectively. But it's something to keep in mind. The opposite could be true too. If you were to take that 400 cubic inch engine and somehow make it, 800 horsepower at 8,500 RPM, I'd be very impressed if somebody managed to do that. But if they did, then that's going to result in very unusually low boost, because the engine is taking in far more air than the supercharger can reasonably keep up with. And that's going to result in unusually low boost. Although I suspect that the formula would still work pretty well at the lower RPM range, because that engine is going to have to be cammed in such a way that it's not going to pull really hard down low. I don't think so. I'm pretty sure I've never seen an 800 horse normally aspirated 400 cubic inch engine. I'm sure they're out there. I'm just saying I haven't seen one. So all of these things can stack up. The supercharger's volumetric efficiency, the engine volumetric efficiency, and the supercharger's volumetric efficiency can go the wrong way if you're using a really, really big supercharger. But the formula will work very well if you have the supercharger sized the way most people would size it, that 1/3 to 1/2 of engine displacement. And you're using an engine that has more or less 1 horsepower per cubic inch. That seems to be the range that seems to work out very well. And that's a typical range for a well set up American V8. I'm not talking about something with, exotic aftermarket heads or anything, but just a regular American V8 with cleaned up ports, decent cam, decent induction and exhaust. And, you can get them up to about 1 horsepower per cubic inch pretty reasonably. And then with a supercharger, this formula will work out almost exactly. Next, I want to discuss supercharger inlet pressure. This is a big deal. Sometimes there's free horsepower for supercharged cars here because this is something that a lot of people overlook, manufacturers, OEM, and sometimes the aftermarket guys. The supercharger creates, as we discussed, a pressure ratio. It doesn't exactly make boost. Remember, the supercharger doesn't know what boost is. It knows a pressure ratio. To put this into perspective and understand how an intake restriction will adversely affect this, let's use an example. Let's suppose we have our Chevy Camaro or whatever it is, and the supercharger gives us a 2-to-1 pressure ratio. And we're down at sea level and on an abnormally high pressure day. Standard day would be 14.7 psi, but to make the math easy, today it's 15.0 psi. Well, how much pressure do we have, pressure absolute, in our intake manifold with our 2-to-1 pressure ratio? Well, of course, we have 30 psi because 2 times 15 is 30. That means that we have 15 pounds of boost. Now, in this example, our Camaro's intake system is 100% efficient. In other words, ambient pressure is what is seen at the supercharger inlet. There's no pressure loss. So it took that 15, it multiplied it by the pressure ratio of 2.0, gave us 30, which is 15 pounds of boost. Great. Now, let's suppose that our Camaro has a really crappy intake system, and I'm going to use a ridiculously extreme case. And let's say that at high RPM, the supercharger, the intake can't keep up with the supercharger, and pressure drops to 12 psi right before the supercharger. Now remember, you won't see any boost loss at low RPM because even the worst possible intake system is going to keep up with the supercharger when it's loafing down at 2,000 RPM or something. But now we're up at 7,000, and the intake can't keep up, and as a result, the supercharger is trying to draw air in faster than the intake is allowing air to reach the supercharger. Pressure drops to 12 psi. Well, the supercharger doesn't really know that. It doesn't have any way of thinking about that. So it still, of course, runs the same pressure ratio, 2-to-1. Well, 2 times 12 is 24. That's 9 pounds of boost because it's only, it's 9 pounds more than ambient. Ambient's still 15. Boost is above ambient. Boost is not above supercharger inlet pressure. It's above ambient. Ambient's 15, and we've only got 24 pounds absolute. So we only have 9 pounds of boost. We went from 15 pounds to 9 pounds based on losing 3 pounds of pressure at the inlet. Now, in reality, it's never going to be that bad. I've certainly never heard of an intake system that bad in a car, but it isn't unusual to have intakes that are 0.3 of a psi low at the high end. And especially if you've got a pressure ratio of 2.5 to 1 or 2.8 to 1 or something, really high like that, or really serious application, you could be losing a pound of boost just from your intake system. So that's a pretty big deal because a pound of boost, when you're paying to develop that boost anyway, is a big hit to your car's performance. And conversely, there could be a benefit if you go the other way. For example, if you have a ram air system that's well set up and rams air to the supercharger inlet, you can gain on a really hot street car at the end of a quarter mile, you can gain as much as 0.2 of a psi from ram air. But remember, that gets multiplied by the supercharger's pressure ratio. So you could have a free 0.5 pound of boost or something there. So there's a big range here that is affected by the intake system, and it's very important to look at. Now, normally, you're not going to see a problem with this. If you have a well-designed aftermarket kit, certainly Kenny Bell, Magnuson, maybe not to quite the same extent, Sprintex, Whipple, those are all going to be really good. You're not going to find much pressure loss there unless you're doing something beyond what the manufacturer of those kits intended. You know, you've done a bunch of things to the engine, or you're driving the supercharger much faster than they had planned for. But generally speaking, that stuff is engineered correctly, and this is not going to be a problem. Where you will see a problem with this is when somebody takes a junkyard supercharger from an OEM application and tries to use it on another engine, and they're creating much more power than the OEM guys anticipated. The problem here is that the OEM guys typically use a throttle that is built into the back of the supercharger that is sized for the airflow requirements for their application. And actually, sometimes they're undersized a little bit right from the factory. And the reason they do that is because they're trying to have the engine respond more smoothly. If you have a really big throttle on a supercharged car, it will become kind of a little bit like an on-off switch more than a throttle. I'm not saying it's unmanageable, but it can be kind of like that. And so to make the operation smoother, the OEM guys typically use a throttle as small as they can get away with. So when you take that and you're trying to make a supercharger set up for a 200 horsepower four-cylinder, and now you're trying to run it on a 350 horse V6, let's say, or maybe even 400 horsepower, that throttle is almost certainly going to be restrictive. And when you run the numbers with this formula, you're going to find you're not getting the boost you expected. And very often this is the problem. The last problem that I see are boost leaks. With a turbo car, especially the turbo guys, they're not used to seeing this. If they have a boost leak big enough to cause a loss of boost, it's really a big leak. Turbo car, you won't see a difference on the boost gauge from something really small like a pinhole leak. That's not to say you're not losing some efficiency or some power, but you're not seeing anything unusual normally on the boost gauge. Supercharged car, I have always been amazed at how small of a leak can result in a large loss of boost. I mean, the smallest leak is always a pound or two of boost, and sometimes more. And where you will typically see the leak is between the supercharger outlet and whatever it connects to, typically an intake manifold, but not always. The supercharger outlet flange, let's call it, is machined to be perfectly flat, and it typically mates to a perfectly flat machine surface on an intake manifold or something similar, top of an intercooler, whatever it is. And this is usually done without a gasket. And to make it seal, manufacturers will run a bead of something. It's very much like a liquid thread lock. Not the liquidy liquid thread lock, but more like the gel type liquid thread lock. And that'll work fine for you. If you use blue or red gel type liquid thread locker and bolt your supercharger to a properly machined surface that's flat, it will seal up beautifully and never have a problem. But if you don't do that, it'll typically leak, and that'll cost you some amount of boost. So that is something to keep in mind. Let's get to the real world applications. All right, I'm back. I took a break for a few minutes there. I'm in a hotel in Germany. I went downstairs, ran into some friends of mine from my crew, ended up talking to them for a little bit. And the result is that by the time I got back to my room here, it's dark outside, so that's why the lighting looks a little bit different. Anyway, we'll talk about Kenny Bell first. I'll use their supercharger kit as an example for these boost and pulley calculations. They make a kit for a lot of engines, but the one I'm using as an example here is for the 6.4 liter Chrysler so-called Hemi V8. It's nominally 392 cubic inches and found in certain versions of the Dodge Charger, Dodge Challenger. A Kenny Bell supercharger for that engine is 2.8 liter. That's 44% of the engine displacement, and that's pretty typical for Kenny Bell. They make some pretty aggressive stuff in terms of supercharger size and size of inlet. They're going for the higher power portion of the supercharging market. I needed to figure out the crank pulley diameter, and that wasn't that easy. Some forum posts say it's 6.125, some say it's 6.25. I think the only difference there is some people are including the lip. I just did the math both ways. So with a 3.25-inch supercharger pulley on this setup, Kenny Bell says you should have 10 psi. The way I did the math, I came up with either 9.54 or 10.03. So the formula worked really, really well here. It's almost right on the money, and could be either slightly higher or very slightly lower, depending on whether you use 6.25 or 6.125. In either case, we're just about right on the money. Now, Kenny Bell also has a 3.5-inch pulley, which runs 8 pounds of boost, and the numbers I came up with there were either 7.8 or 8.26, again, depending on which pulley. So that's within a quarter of a pound of Kenny Bell's numbers. So The formula worked really well there, which I think also shows how well Kenny Bell has their supercharger set up. Even though it's pretty big, it's reaching those high levels of volumetric efficiency, which of course we want. There was one more Kenny Bell pulley combination that didn't come out quite as well. Again, on the 6.4 liter Chrysler, they offer a 7.5 inch crank pulley combined with a 3-inch supercharger pulley, and they say to expect 15 pounds of boost with that combination. The math shows 17.5. So I think Kenny Bell is just understating the performance capability of that combination. Either that or that 2.8 liter supercharger just can't keep up when you spin it that fast, but I find that very unlikely. The next supercharger testing I want to talk about is from another YouTube channel, a channel that's way more than twice as big as mine, so it's a big one, is Richard Holdener. Richard Holdener does dyno testing, engine dyno, not chassis dyno, primarily anyway, of all sorts of interesting things and combination, high dollar stuff, low dollar stuff. And he recently had a video where he took a Chevrolet 4.8 liter LS, a relatively good motor, but also a relatively undesirable motor because everybody wants the bigger motors, the 5.3 LS or 6 or 6.2 or whatever. Probably the 5.3 is undesirable too. In any case, took the 4.8 liter LS, souped it up a little bit, high-rise manifold, a cam, and exhaust headers, and ran it on the dyno, got 375 horsepower from it, which is pretty commendable. Then he added an Eaton M90 5th generation supercharger, which is an extremely common supercharger. The M90 is probably the most common junkyard supercharger. They were used on Buicks, Olds, Pontiacs, Chevrolets, all kinds of stuff. And the 5th generation was the final M90 before they went to a much more modern type of supercharger. And the M90 has just the only difference between the 5th gen M90 and the 4th gen is the coatings on the rotors that tighten up the clearance volume, which kind of matters, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. He did not get stellar results from this, and I should say that, you know, that's not a criticism of Richard Holdener. Please don't take it that way. He's doing excellent work. He's taking a low-cost engine nobody wants. He's taking a supercharger that is dirt cheap, and he's combining the two, and he's getting some interesting data, and he's getting some okay results from it. So let's talk about that for a bit. He ran it with 3 crank pulleys, a 3.8 inch, 3 inch, and a 2.6 inch. He never in the video says what size the supercharger pulley is, but he gives the supercharger speed versus engine speed. So from that, I was able to deduce the supercharger is 7.44 inches. When you do the math here, for the 3.8 liter pulley, I come up with 2.9 pounds of boost, but he was only getting 1.6. Then he ran it with a 3-inch pulley, and I come up with 7.5 pounds, but he's only getting 6. So the supercharger is underperforming. And then he ran a 2.6-inch pulley, and I come up with 11.1 pounds of boost, and he's only getting 8. So at the higher boost levels, that thing is really starting to underperform. And the whole combination is underperforming. With 8 pounds of boost, a 375 horsepower engine should easily be over 500 horsepower. I mean, without any problem. And it was 451. That's on gasoline. So it's way short of where it should be, and the boost is short of where it should be, but it's way short on power for the lower level of boost. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this. One, maybe the supercharger is leaking where it's sealing to the manifold. I think that's possible. I don't know if everything there was milled perfectly flat. I didn't see any sealant in use when he installed the supercharger onto the adapter plate that he had made to bolt it to this high-rise manifold. So it could be leaking there. But then again, you know, a lot of stuff happens off camera when people make these YouTube videos, so I really have no way of knowing. Also, I suspect that there's some pressure drop in the supercharger inlet between the throttle and the rotors, but I don't know, but it looks to me like there probably would be because he's, you know, trying to get a lot of power out of this supercharger, more than the OEM application ever intended, far more. But the additional problem, and this is not a problem with the way anything is done in this testing, it's a problem with the Eaton M90. I got to say, I don't like the Eaton M90. I don't like any of them. 3rd gen, 4th gen, 5th gen. The problem is with that particular supercharger, it's not with Eaton's and not with, you know, really anything that Magnuson does or any of those guys, but that Eaton M90 uses a rotor group that is from the Eaton M112, but it is shortened. And the reason this matters is because root superchargers, this is a problem that is largely but not entirely specific to root superchargers. They suffer from something called slip. Now, this is not belt slippage. This is supercharger slip. And this is not a term I'm making up. This is from NACA. What supercharger slip is the high pressure air, the air that's been boosted, going back through the clearance volume and ending up back on the intake side and then getting recycled through and heated up again. So you see, the root supercharger doesn't compress air internally. Therefore, the boosted air that's on the outlet side is at much higher pressure on the inlet than on the inlet side. Obviously, that's what the supercharger does. And then that boosted air, because the supercharger is not compressing internally, can go back through the clearance volume, and it does that, and that's called supercharger slip. Well, okay, all roots blowers do that, but what makes the M90 especially bad in regards to slip is that it uses a shortened rotor set from the Eaton M112. Now, if you just think about the geometry of this, if you shorten supercharger rotors, you are increasing the amount of clearance volume relative to the supercharger displacement. And the reason for that is the clearance volumes at the ends stayed the same, but the overall volume went down. Now, the clearance volume as a total went down because the rotors got shorter, but as a percentage of the supercharger displacement, the clearance volume goes up. So you generally want to avoid superchargers that have shortened rotor groups. It's done for packaging, and the M90's performance numbers, I mean, the official ones from Eaton, they make charts that show volumetric efficiency and discharge temps and all kinds of things. The M90 is significantly worse than either the M62, which has skinnier rotors but relatively longer, or the M112, which has the same rotors and are longer. And that's part of the reason nobody really wants the M90s. It's maybe people aren't really aware of the slip issue, although some are, but nobody gets really great results with those M90s. And actually, the 451 horsepower that he got on that 4.8 is really, really good. And then with combining that with E85 and some timing changes and other things, I think he got it up to 480 maybe, which is really, really commendable. But it's just the wrong supercharger. I understand what he's doing, and it makes a lot of sense, but it's not a particularly great supercharger for that application, and it has one of those problems. I tend to think it's an inlet pressure issue more than anything else, but I'm really not sure because I'm not there. Anyway, you should check out his channel. His name's Richard Holdener. Just it's spelled the way it sounds. Also, I want to mention David Vizard's channel. I've been mentioning him more often now. He's got a YouTube channel, and the guy knows an amazing amount of stuff. Almost everything I know about engines either came from my dad, NACA, or David Vizard. I've been reading his books since the 90s, I think since he wrote the first one, and there's a tremendous amount of knowledge in his books, and especially on his YouTube channel, because on his channel he can go into more details and go down side roads when he's talking about things and really cover things in detail. So again, I recommend checking out David Vizard's channel. That's all I've got for now. I'm not anticipating making any more supercharger technical videos, not in the near future. I might. I do have a supercharged car, which is kind of interesting, and I might talk about that some more in the future. But that's all I've got for now. So goodbye. Thanks very much for watching. I really appreciate it, and have a good day.